Okay, it says we are live, so I'm going to call the meeting to order. It is February 16th already. And this is the Senate Finance Committee. Today, we're going to take some time. We've got newbies on the committee, and I will admit the world of RECs is not totally clear to me. So we have Maria Fisher, who is the Utilities Economic Analysis from the Department of Public Service. And Maria, I'm hoping you can help the committee just as we're talking about how RECs work. And I know we've made changes to how they work and who can buy them and who can sell them in the past few years. So if you can just give us like 101, what are RECs? How do they work?
Sure, that's what I'm here for. I'm Maria Fisher from the Department of Public Service, and I will attempt to share my screen, and hopefully I do that successfully. Did that work?
Yep, it's up.
Okay, great. So we are going to start off with just a general overview of renewable energy requirements throughout New England. And then we'll get into a little bit more detail on RECs, what they are, why we need them, and how they work. And then we'll go into REC pricing and what we've seen historically with those prices and how they can sometimes be pretty unpredictable and volatile. So renewable requirements throughout the US and New England are set by state policy regarding the amount or quantity of renewables needed, the type and the pace of renewable requirements. They're often called renewable portfolio standards, or in Vermont, we call it the Renewable Energy Standard, but they're essentially equivalent. And RECs are the market mechanism that allow for the tracking and trading of renewable attributes. And they prevent the double counting or more than one entity claiming those attributes. So in Vermont, RES was enacted in 2015. Compliance began in 2017 with requirements increasing each year. And tiers 1 and 2 of RES require the retirement of RECs. And we'll go into a little bit more of what all this terminology means, but I think it's helpful to just have an overview of kind of why we need it. And the retirement of RECs really brings Vermont in line with all the other states in the region, which have all been requiring RECs for several years now. And then another thing to note, in addition to renewable portfolio standards and renewable requirements, a lot of states are also now going down the path of clean energy standards, which is more of an emissions focused program. And so it doesn't have to be renewable, but Hydro-Quebec is one of the resources that falls into both of these categories. So HQ is an eligible renewable resource in Vermont, which is fairly unique. And more recently, other states have said that it's also clean. And so that creates more demand for Hydro-Quebec throughout the region. So this slide just goes into a little bit more detail on Vermont's Tier 1 and Tier 2 resources and what it means to be a Vermont Tier 1 resource. So Tier 1 is the total renewables requirement in Vermont. And that essentially means that any resource that is from a renewable resource can be counted. It doesn't matter when it was built, how big it is, as long as it delivers energy to New England. And so that includes any resource within New England, as well as resources that are imported from New York or neighboring Canadian provinces, which in our case is Hydro-Quebec, which some of our utilities use quite a bit of to meet their requirements. And this Tier 1 is similar to what's called Class 2 in most other states, or Rhode Island existing. But one of the unique aspects of Tier 1 is that it does allow for Hydro-Quebec. So that means that Vermont has a bigger supply of existing resources than some other states. And then Tier 2
is that, Madam Chair, is that a bigger supply of existing resources, or by definition has a bigger supply of resources?
right, by definition of what meets our eligibility criteria. So
We have a different definition, which makes us appear to have more of a supply than we would have had if we'd had the same definition as the other states we're compared to. Is that correct?
correct.
Thank you.
Senator Pearson, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, Maria, I thought I just heard you say more states are opening up to using Rex from HQ, but so maybe I missed that, or could you just highlight that? Because we talked about HQ for about a fair bit last year, and I think we're unique to accepting their Rex, but I wonder if you could help me understand that.
Right, so Massachusetts has recently adopted a clean energy standard. So it's not a part of their renewable portfolio standard, but it requires, it's a program to reduce emissions. And so as part of that program, Hydro-Quebec does count towards those goals. And so that creates a lot more demand for those HQ attributes. So Vermont is the only state that currently treats it as renewable, but there is other demand for those attributes for the zero emissions aspect of it.
So does that mean Massachusetts is about to be competing with us for HQ Rex?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, so
Trying to extend transmission lines, right? Down. Well, I like they thought they might come down through Vermont. Now they're coming down through Maine. Is there I know.
I'm not familiar with all the specifics.
Okay. I know there's been some activity there. Okay, we'll go back to Rex.
Yeah, we can follow up on the specifics of the supply and demand of HQ and what other states might be allowing in the future. I know that as of now, Massachusetts has not qualified HQ specific resources from HQ to comply with their program, but they are pending as of now.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
can I ask a quick question? So can you distinguish for the committee the differences between buying power and buying RECs, and whether they always travel together or they can be separated and sold separately?
The short answer is they can be separated and sold separately, but I do have a slide on that coming up in a couple slides. So we will get to that, and if you still have questions, then you can ask again.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Back to the slides.
And so Vermont Tier 2 is our premium class of RECs, and this is similar to Class 1 in other states, but it's a much smaller subset of what other states consider premium, because Vermont requires it to be small projects, less than 5 megawatts, commissioned after 2015 and located in Vermont. And so this chart on the left is just to illustrate that every state has slightly different requirements, and there is often a lot of overlap, but there's also a lot of pieces that don't overlap. I'll give you all a second to digest that chart, or at least come up with any questions if you have any.
No, that's-
I have a question.
Sure.
How do I read that? I'm trying to figure out.
So looking at just an example, there's Connecticut Class 1 is a big box in the middle, and that overlaps significantly with Maine Class 1. A big chunk of Massachusetts Class 1 falls within Connecticut Class 1. But then there's also a lot of Connecticut Class 1 that's not overlapping with other states. And so Connecticut allows biomass to qualify for their premium rec, and most other states do not. And so that's part of why Connecticut isn't overlapping entirely with Massachusetts or some other
Okay.
states. So that's
So-
just an example.
Sure. So those areas, each square rectangle represents different attributes of a rec. And it's like a collection of attributes. Some of them are the same state to state. So those are the ones that overlap. And the ones that are unique, like you just said, Connecticut biomass, that would be outside. No one else is overlapping that part of their rectangle.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
So what are recs used for? They're used to demonstrate compliance. Each year, Vermont requires their utilities to file a compliance report by August 31st, showing what their annual retail sales were, what their res requirements were, and how many recs they retired and how many they banked. And so in the rec world, banking means that you can hang on to a rec to use it in the future. And so everything that they have in one year can be carried forward to be used in future years. And recs are associated with the calendar year that they were generated in. So this slide will get at how recs can be separated from the energy. The environmental attribute from a megawatt hour of generation by a qualified renewable resource. That is the definition of what a rec is. The energy and attributes can be separated and traded independently of each other. The energy goes through ISO New England and is settled on that platform. Sorry about that. And then the recs all go through NEPOOL GIS, and that's the platform where they're transferred and tracked. And also retired. And so that's the platform where the department at the end of the year can go in and verify that the utilities have in fact retired recs and do have ownership of them at the end of the year.
Can I ask a quick question on that one? So do recs by definition expire at the end of every year, even if you have a 10-year contract? So you know you're going to keep getting them from a particular qualified resource. The recs from that resource, you bring them to NEPOOL GIS, they're logged there or whatever, and then they retire there. And you have to maintain that contract for the next year and buy yet again to fulfill your res requirement, your rec requirement.
Right, yes.
Okay.
They can only be used once for a single year of compliance.
I thought you said they could be banked.
They can be banked for use in future years, but they can only be used a single time.
Okay,
So if they're used in 2018, then they can't be banked, but you can bank recs from 2018 to be used in 2019.
okay.
So I have a really fundamental question. Can I go back to that previous slide?
Sure.
Am I understanding a rec to be the number of megawatt hours of total generation that comes from a qualified source. So if Green Mountain Power puts out 100,000 megawatts, am I not on? I'm sorry.
You're on.
You're on.
Okay. So if they put out 100,000 megawatts of electricity, and half of them come from a renewable energy source, they have 50,000 megawatts of RECs.
Correct.
Wow. Okay.
So moving on to the next slide.
Right.
Why do we need RECs? Again, it all goes back to compliance. RECs are the tool used for the counting, tracking, and assigning of ownership of the renewable attributes and really all environmental attributes. The RECs create fungible commodity that can be traded, and it's a uniform system to ensure that there's no double counting. So when you sell a REC, you are giving up the ability to claim that renewability. And the RECs allow the transfer and tracking of ownership in NEPOOL GIS.
May I ask a question?
Yes,
Sure.
Senator Brock.
As we talk about, the various states have, in some cases, different requirements as to what constitutes renewable energy. How do you reconcile those things when states don't agree fully on what a REC represents?
So in NEPOOL GIS, which is the platform that all these RECs are tracked and created, they have different columns for each class and each state. And so when a generator applies for REC certification in a state, then that state will then reach out to NEPOOL GIS, and NEPOOL GIS will mark that generator to show that, they'll essentially check the box that says, Vermont Tier 1, check, Massachusetts Class 1, check. And so in NEPOOL GIS, there's probably 20 columns with each state and each class of RECs, and it says yes or no in each of those fields to let you know whether it qualifies as a REC in each of those states.
Okay.
Okay, any more questions at this point? All right,
One
let's
more
move
quick
on.
one. So at the end of a year, is there basically a truing up process where utilities will check where they are and then they go into that market to end the year with the required number of RECs to meet their portfolio standard for their home state?
Exactly. Yes, each utility has an account in NEPOOL GIS, and they, at the end of the year, hold those RECs in different sub-accounts. Each utility might do it differently, but they have an account that says Vermont Tier 1, and they'll have all their attributes and RECs that are qualified as Vermont Tier 1 in that folder, and that will either be equal to or greater than whatever their Tier 1 requirement is.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Guess we can move forward.
Okay.
I do have a question, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Maria, if I search my memory way before I really understood a lot of this, I thought we put the state on a trajectory to retire RECs. And I know that at some level we're doing that maybe it's the Tier 2, but is there a time, first of all, is that accurate? Will we be retiring all the RECs, and are other states doing the same thing, or just make sure I understand that, if you wouldn't mind.
When you say retiring all the RECs, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. Do you mean all the in-state recs?
Well,
or-
see, I don't know what I mean, but are we always going to live in a world where we have RECs, or are we going to eventually end this facade of this strange accounting system?
For the foreseeable future, I think we're going to be using recs as the mechanism to show compliance. And yes, all the other states are doing the same thing. I would say that Vermont is definitely a little bit different because the path that we've taken to get here, we had the SPEED program, which encouraged renewable development and required long-term contracts, but it did not require the retirement of RECs. And so with that program, utilities were required to build and contract for bigger renewable projects. But now those projects, which qualify as premium RECs in other states, only qualify as Tier 1 in Vermont, which has a much lower value. So Vermont sells a lot of premium RECs out of state and purchases lower value RECs to kind of backfill the total renewables requirement. I'm not sure, did that get at your question?
Yeah, and there's no phasing out really.
Not under the current, under what's currently written as eligibility for Tier 1 and Tier 2. I mean, if there was a reason for Vermont utilities to retire those premium RECs, then I'm sure that they would, but at this point, no, they're going to continue to sell them out of state to reduce their rates.
Senator Pearson, I'm wondering too, if you're bringing up the whole thing of with net metering, there were questions around how RECs were handled in net metering. That used to be one, that changed, the rules changed over time, and it changed how you were paid if you let your utility retire them versus you held them. So that was another wrinkle that maybe is part of your trying to remember what was going on that's changed lately.
Thank you.
Right, so now net metering projects do need to specify whether or not they will transfer the RECs to the utility. And if they do, then they get compensated at a higher price. And the utilities then are required to retire those RECs and use them towards their Tier 2 obligation, or if they don't have a Tier 2 obligation, they still must retire those RECs. So all the net metering RECs that transfer to the utility stay within the state. But
Maria,
there-
Maria, this is Ed, if I can jump in for a second as well. So Ed McNamara, Director of Planning for Department of Public Service. Just on this last few minutes, I think it's also important to remember that prior to 2015, prior to passage of Renewable Energy Standard, we had the SPEED program. The SPEED program was designed to finance projects, finance a certain type of projects, renewable, did not require the retirement of RECs. So essentially we had the utilities either build or enter into long-term contract for lots of different types of renewable projects. And then the RES, Renewable Energy Standard, did not line up with the SPEED. So the projects that were built in part as a result of SPEED, including Kingdom Community Wind, and I know Maria's got a slide on this later, that was a result of legislative requirements related to renewables, but not related to retirement of RECs. So I think that's a fundamental difference. Once we, in 2015, we switched from the long-term contract or building a project to doing what pretty much every other state in the country does, which is using a market-based mechanism of renewable energy credits to track the attributes and to incentivize new renewable projects. And Maria, feel free to correct me if I get any of that wrong.
Nope, that was all right.
Okay. We ready to move on to the next slide? Okay, let's keep moving.
Okay. So I think we've mentioned a couple times rec trading. Rec trading is just the transfer of ownership of recs and the right to claim that renewability. The participants in this market include utilities that have compliance obligations, generators, and there's speculators out there also that help to make it a pretty liquid market most of the time. The trades can be direct between two counterparties, arranged by a broker through an auction or an RFP. And there's different types of trades. You can buy a one-time single year short-term purchase of a firm quantity, or there can be long-term unit contingent contracts and lots of different variations in between. And this slide just shows some of the different fields that NEPOOL GIS tracks with each certificate and each generator. And some of the information is public, some of it is limited to just the compliance, the utilities that have compliance obligations, and then regulators are also able to go in, but it shows where facilities are located, when they were built. It has a unique ID number, fuel type, nameplate capacity, when the generation actually took place, which is what they call the vintage of RECs, and then where that unit is eligible to receive RECs. And then we get into REC pricing. So in theory, RECs were intended to bridge the gap between what it costs to build renewable energy and what the market revenues would be through energy markets, capacity, ancillary services. And that difference was what the REC price is intended to be. In reality, it ends up really being determined by supply and demand. The supply is set by the projects that are out there, and demand is set by the rules and loads in the region. Different tiers and classes of eligibility means that there's going to be different values, and each REC market has an alternative compliance payment called an ACP, and that essentially sets the price ceiling for all these markets, because utilities have the option to pay that price rather than buying on the market. And so the ACP is set in the low $60 range for premium RECs in most states right now. So currently, Vermont Tier 1, the existing class of RECs, trades for around 50 cents to $2 per REC, and the premium class is trading at around $40 a REC. But as I said, these markets can be really volatile, and the addition of some large projects can really depress prices, or news of a delay or a canceled project can really change what the supply looks like in future years. So you can sometimes see really big jumps, as shown in this chart, over short periods of time. So this chart is just showing Massachusetts Class 1 REC prices, which is really the biggest market in the region, and what they've done over time. So you can see that in 2013, prices were in the mid $60, which was right around the ACP, which means that there was a shortage in the market, where it was very, very tight, that market. And then a lot of renewable projects began to be built. And then by 2018, prices were below $10 in the single digits. And a lot of projects had come online, loads were reducing, requirements were reducing, and prices really plummeted. Prices have rebounded quite a bit in recent years, now back up into the $40 range. And so that's reflecting a pretty balanced market at the moment.
Okay, any questions? I'm not hearing any. Okay.
And then I think that this is my last slide, and this is just an example of rec arbitrage, which is an activity that a lot of our utilities engage in. And the definition of arbitrage is just the near simultaneous buying and selling of commodities in different markets in order to take advantage of different prices. And so I have an example here of Kingdom Community Wind, which is a utility-owned project in Vermont. And so in 2019, an example of annual generation was about 160,000 megawatt hours were generated. The utilities, after that was generated, they hold on to they have ownership of those RECs. So they have the option to either retire them or sell them. If they retired them in Vermont, they would have qualified for Vermont Tier 1 compliance, which would have a value of roughly $80,000. Alternatively, they could sell them into Massachusetts, Connecticut, or Rhode Island for Class 1 value, which totaled roughly $3.7 million. But after selling those RECs, they still have the requirement to have their Tier 1, to meet their Tier 1 obligation. So they do need to purchase RECs to fill that requirement. But the cost of those RECs is only 50 cents. And so they'll get a revenue of 3.7 million and a cost of 80,000. And the net benefit to Vermonters is 3.6 million in this example. And so this example is exactly why we see a lot of our in-state RECs getting sold to other neighboring states.
Okay. Any questions at this point?
What's the basis for the very significant difference? Is it that what we're producing is simply cheaper, or that we're producing stuff that others can't produce in terms of the environmental attributes? Why such a big difference in terms of value?
Between selling it out of state versus hanging on to it?
Correct.
It really comes down to the definition of what Class 1 is versus what Vermont Tier 1 is and Vermont Tier 2. So Class 1 in other states, they don't have the same size requirements as us. And so Kingdom Community Wind qualifies as a Class 1 in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, even though it's 63 megawatts. And so in Vermont, our definition of a premium renewable is that it has to be less than 5 megawatts. And so it's not included in that premium market. And it's only eligible to get Vermont Tier 1 RECs, which is equivalent to the existing classes in other states.
But we see a very large net benefit to Vermonters. Does the reverse ever occur?
I can't think of an example where it would occur, because Vermont, the Tier 2 premium class in Vermont is so small and it's required to be in state that in order for the reverse to happen, Vermont utilities would be required to be paying that higher price. And all those resources are located within Vermont.
Well, I'm just trying to understand why Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island would pay such a large amount of money for something that we value at so much less. Why would they do that?
ideally, they would obviously rather not be sending their money out of state, but just the way that their RPSs are structured, it allows for any resource in New England that delivers energy to New England. And wind resources almost universally, except for Vermont, qualify for that premium status. And their requirements are much higher. So yeah, sorry, I'm not doing a very good job of explaining that. I'll let you jump in there, Ed.
Yeah, thanks. So, Senator, it really has to do with the REC prices are a function of how states set their renewable policy. Most of the states, especially Connecticut and Massachusetts, which are the largest states by load, they're about 75% of the load in New England, they're much more focused on grid connected, so transmission connected projects. So you actually get these large projects. When Vermont set its renewable energy standard, excuse me, it focused on distributed generation. Those were the high cost RECs. So the RECs from distributed generation, and then to counter what was, I believe, then expected to be higher costs for the RECs for the distributed generation, it implemented Tier 1 and basically bypassed entirely this new regional product that most of the other states have. When Maria was talking about Massachusetts and Connecticut Class 1, Rhode Island Class 1, that's essentially any wind, solar project, different variations that came online after a certain date, usually early 2000s or so. So we often talk about it as regional Class 1. That was a common product a lot of states did when they first created their RPSs early on, because the intent was to incentivize new renewable generation without really focusing on where that new generation would be built. Vermont took the different tack of saying we want as much distributed generation in state as possible, and for the rest of it, we're okay with this inexpensive existing tier. Was that at all helpful?
Well, it was in a way, but I picture myself sitting in this seat in Massachusetts and trying to explain to my constituents why I just spent $3.7 million to buy something worth $80,000 from Vermont. And I'm just having difficulty trying to articulate that. I mean, this reminds me of Enron, quite frankly.
So I'll try. Basically, RECs are a commodity, and there's different types of commodities. Tier 1 are essentially like the pork bellies. We can just buy them from cheap. So, and then you've got the regional Class 1 or essentially the better priced commodities. We focused on not purchasing those regional commodities and focused on the regional new stuff and focused only on the regional existing. So Tier 1 is not meant to incentivize new generations, meant to essentially keep existing generation going, existing renewable generation going. And that's essentially each legislature makes their own choice about how to set the RPS. And I've had the inverse discussion with all of my colleagues in New England states about why isn't Vermont doing enough to support the regional grid and doing more to support the development of renewables in New England. I've been on the receiving end of that question a fair amount as well.
Well, I would think just logically going through that argument, and I don't know if I'll get a real comfort level, but going through that argument, I would think that those states would want Vermont to pay more rather than less. And there's just no mechanism for that to happen in the system that's being explained here. Because it looks like, I'm not arguing with the fact that looks like we're getting a heck of a deal, but it always makes me wonder, why would they do that?
And an important thing to keep in mind is Vermont is 4% of New England's load. So a lot of times what we do has very minimal impact. What Maria just sort of walked through, this arbitrage example, 3.6 million is a drop in the bucket for Massachusetts. So what we do has an impact. It does not have, it has a greater impact on Vermont than it does on Massachusetts or Connecticut. So I think that's the primary. And also it's important to remember that unlike energy and capacity, which Maria touched on earlier, are traded through ISO New England, those are federally regulated commodities. Renewable energy credits, those are state creation. They're governed by state law. And so Massachusetts couldn't force Vermont to implement a more stringent RES if they wanted to.
Sure. Is there any, are there any odd results or results that are misleading based on how Vermont accounts for things because of this tremendous disparity that we see in value? In other words, do we look particularly good for no fault of our own or no result of what we've actually done? Because it looks like we're making a land office profit.
So I would say that I believe every state has an existing, an equivalent of a tier 1 requirement. Most of the time that tier 1 requirement, actually in all cases in other New England states, that tier 1 requirement is not the majority of the requirement. Instead, I believe usually it's the majority is new renewables, not maintaining existing renewables. So I'm not, we're inconsistent with the application. We're not inconsistent with the intent, if that makes sense.
Well, I'll just ask one last question because I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but suppose this whole arrangement of RECs and arbitrage and so on went away and there wasn't anything like that at all. Would we do anything different?
I believe we would. The reason I'm hesitating on that is that we've had so much history of Vermont procurement requirements. I mean, the legislature essentially told Green Mountain Power and the other utilities, go out and build wind, go out and contract for wind. Mm-hmm. And is now saying, okay, that wind that you built, we don't value that. So sell that to Massachusetts, sell it to Connecticut. So I think it's largely a function of how the RES is created. I'm not sure if that's responsive to your question or not.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed.
Yep.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, is that Senator Pearson?
Yes,
Okay.
please. Ed, in response to Senator Brock's question, which is an interesting one, wouldn't we, if it all went away and we still did that in the context, Senator Brock's got a good picture now. If it all went away, but we still had a state goal of more renewables, forgive me, it's a snow day, we would build more renewable generation in state, right? Or maybe partner with some regional. Isn't that a very likely outcome if this weird accounting fiction all went away?
So first on the weird accounting fiction, I want to make this note earlier. I think it's similar to a lot of people think Venmo is crazy. People thought credit cards were crazy. People thought paper currency was crazy. We're not all carrying around gold in our pockets to pay for stuff. You always come up with some way of creating a commodity system. So RECs have been in place for decades and they're sort of standard currency. In terms of, you could just tell the utilities, just buy this, just go out and procure energy types if you want. And Vermont would just go back to where we were prior to 2015, where if we're not using the same system as everybody else, if we're outside of this common currency that the rest of the US uses, we would end up, I'm not sure what you do with the RECs at that point.
Okay. Senator Bray.
So I'm going to try to make sure that I had this, picture of how this worked And now I can see there's some cracks in Humpty Dumpty. So I want to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I just thought of RECs as each state defined a certain value for certain kind of attributes associated with a certain generation. And they say, we're willing to pay that amount in order to subsidize, basically offer a second stream of revenue. On top of the power you generate, you can receive the REC value, and for each megawatt hour. And it was a subsidy system. And so different states came up with a vision of different, what they thought was worth paying for. Connecticut, their definition of what was worth paying a higher value REC included something like Lowell. Vermont defined the thresholds differently. And so they're just not eligible to sell it for high value in Vermont. So you go shopping where you're going to get your best price. And it seemed like it just came down to how each state defined the collection of attributes associated with the generation. And then you go shopping to sell at your best price as a utility. Is that reasonable? Or am I making that up because it's a comforting story?
It makes you feel good, Senator.
Go ahead, Maria.
Well,
No, I didn't hear any major cracks in that story.
all right, I'm going to quit while I'm ahead then.
I'm going to start again, and I probably should quit while but in a way, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, what I thought I heard was that, let's take the paper money example. Vermont creates $1 and we back it with an ounce of gold. Massachusetts creates $1 and it backs it with 37 pounds of gold, and we trade it with each other.
Can
That's
we
what I
all
think.
write that? Is it true that Senator Brock keeps arguing that our electric rate should be higher?
Well,
I think at this point, it's working for us. That's what.
It is. I don't want to fool with it if it's working for us.
Right. Well, and to come back around to where we were, the last Friday, I guess it was, we were talking about the RECs associated with Rygate. And so it's my understanding that they would ordinarily not be eligible for treatment as class 1 because they're over that 5 megawatt limit, but that we're declaring by fiat or law that they actually are class 1 eligible. And so you can go shopping in Connecticut where they value biomass and get a higher value for that REC, and then do that REC arbitrage step that we were just looking at. And based on the law as proposed to be amended, when I did the math on it, at the current Connecticut class 1 REC price of $41.33, it was like $7.3 million a year if they're generating whatever it was, 179,000 megawatt hours a year. So it was, times 10 years, now we're talking 73 million bucks. I know they're more volatile than that, but for scale, it seemed like there's serious money at play underneath on this project. And I don't know if I haven't heard anyone make the argument, well, so this is worth keeping because that money flows into the Vermont utilities that are obligated to buy this power, and it reduces rate pressure.
This is getting into our next topic. The first one was just Rex 101. And do we have any general questions on Rex at this point? If not, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Ed. I think we now at least have a foundation for understanding how the system works as we get into more specifics. And I was going to give you a break, but all our next witnesses are here. So I'm going to start. If we move along well, we can perhaps take a break in the middle. We're going to finish. We have, some of us have chairs meeting at 4, so we're going to end a little earlier. We've got a full number on S1, and we had booked these last week. I've had requests to testify from other folks, and what I've told them is we've spent a lot of time on this one. So I'm going to take a break and get us up to speed on some other bills, and then we'll come back to it. And the folks that wanted to testify that haven't, will get in next time we take it up. So if you have anyone that you know about that wants to testify in S1, just have them let Faith know, and next time we put this one on the agenda, we'll take it up. So we're going to move on, and we're starting with Marcus Bradley, and I did say he's here. Mr. Bradley, I don't know if you've testified before or on Zoom, but we just ask you to identify yourself for the record, and then the floor is yours.
Okay, my name is Marcus Bradley. I am a part owner of Red Start Forestry. I've started working with Red Start in 1998, and I live in Vermont, Vermont. And we're one of the larger consulting firms in the state of Vermont, at least as far as number of clients. Most of our work is through the current use program. We have approximately 1,000 non-industrial clients that we help manage woodland for. I was asked to give a statement about the Rygate power plant, so I could give you a quick update from my perspective. There's some things that are in motion that none of us are going to stop. You probably all know that the paper mill in Jay, Maine, the digester blew up, and they've decided not to rebuild this digester. It's my understanding that facility consumed both hardwood and softwood pulp to the tune of about 250 tractor trailer trucks per day. For me locally, Jay, Maine represented the main softwood pulp market. And does everybody know what pulpwood is versus biomass versus saw logs? People have an
Why don't you tell us, just so it's on the record?
Okay, so pulpwood would simply be made into paper, and I may mistakenly call softwood pulp when I kind of mean biomass. Money-wise, it's traditionally been about the same. Biomass, like the Rygate power plant, is wood that's actually burnt and to make electricity. They can use also hardwood pulp. Hardwood pulp could also be used as, say, firewood, depending on the species. And within the last 25 years, I think you know something about this, but we've started to heat schools and municipal buildings specifically with hardwood pulp. For me specifically, the Rygate power plant represents a way of getting rid of softwood pulp. Most of Vermont is old pasture. The first trees in the old pasture, typically white pine, didn't have a lot of competition. White pine weevil is this insect that likes to chew into the terminal bud and causes the trees to be deformed. So a lot of the white pine that we have on these old pasture stands that are now 60, 70, 80 years old, a lot of them have lots of twists and turns and bends, and they're really only suitable for pulpwood or biomass. They're not suitable for saw logs. The saw logs being a more scarce product, a more valuable product. In the forestry world, what we're trying to do is grow more of the valuable products so that our clients eventually will get a little bit better return on harvesting timber and owning land. With sort of sugar maple veneer being the most scarce and the most valuable, you can have a tractor trailer truck worth $20,000, as where a load of pine pulp to a client is virtually worth nothing. In fact, you can pretty much, for a long time now, basically the removal of softwood pulp is often subsidized by the harvest of the saw logs in a beginning project, if that makes sense. The basic concept with forestry is that we're going to grow about a third of a cord per acre per growing season in Vermont, whether we do it on 500 trees an acre or whether we do it on 250 trees an acre. And so a lot of our work is trying to remove the underperforming trees and try to direct growth towards the stems that we like. It's not always timber trees, sometimes it's wildlife trees. And that's the objective. So I did a little chicken scratch because I basically was told, well, how important is Rygate? So I went back through my roles in 2020. Our company helped conduct 43 timber sales. 25% of them shipped wood directly to Rygate. In 2019, we did 45 timber sales. 17 of them shipped wood to Rygate. In 2018, 50 timber sales and 19 of them. So somewhere in the 25 to almost 40% range of the timber sales that we do, the wood will ultimately end up in Rygate, the lower quality portions, the tops of the pine trees, the twisted, the portions that are not suitable to be turned into to saw logs. And in the hardwood, I want to make this really clear, and hardwood pulp is more valuable typically as firewood or hardwood pulp into paper. Typically hardwood trees, with the exception of the very top of the tree, is not chipped and turned into biomass and sent to Rygate. It's more valuable being sold as pulpwood or as school wood, if you will. The closure of the J plant is a really big deal to me. And as far as I can tell, it's going to be nothing but pain and suffering in the logging community until enough people go out of business for it to become somewhat profitable again to cut pulpwood. I can only imagine what life is honestly like in Maine or in Hampshire as you get closer to the mill. The pressure on the Rygate power plant to purchase softwood pulp is great. The regulatory forester and the procurement forester is a guy named Tyler Mousley. Tyler worked for me for 7 years. He's a wonderful man. He's under considerable strain right now. There's a lot of people that are looking to sell softwood pulp and chips to Rygate because it's one of the last options. One little tidbit that I heard was that Stanley Robinson, who is a concentration yard in Passumpsic, Vermont, they also buy biomass that's ultimately shipped to Berlin, New Hampshire. Stanley's delivered price right now is $10 a ton. $10 a ton is not enough money to even pay the trucking in most scenarios, unless you happen to be logging right next to the mill. It's my understanding that Stanley is chucker blocked full. Does not want any more. It's not a sustainable situation. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are about to go under, and it's probably going to be worse in Maine and New Hampshire. The point that I want to make about Rygate is that of all the wood markets out there, the Rygate power plant to me buys the worst of the worst. The very poorest trees that you can grow in the forest ultimately end up in a place like Rygate or Burlington Electric. Any sawmill or any pulpwood or any remaining pulpwood markets, they could have liquidation logging, poor logging practices feeding the mill. The Rygate power plant, the part of the approval process, at least in Vermont, the harvesting is done at reasonably good standards, and because of the price structure the way it is, it's really just the lowest quality wood that ends up at the Rygate power plant. So it's ideal in my perspective that there's a market like Rygate that exists. Right now, with the closure of the J plant, I want to point out that there's a couple different ways to log. Whole tree harvest equipment, which is typical. I'm not in love with this type of equipment. It tends to be big. It tends to be heavy. There are definitely people that do it well, but it's modern logging equipment, and its ability to have impact on the resources there. But right now, the type of logging that I think I prefer the most, where you have someone that's conventionally logging, where they chop trees down with a chainsaw, they limb them out. Softwood pulp is really not an option. So right now, if you're a chainsaw logger, you're in a scenario where you really can't buy a job that's got softwood trees at all. Because what are you going to do with the pulp? You can't sell it. You know, the spruce and fir stand, where the amount of rot in the trees is unknown, or the mediocre average Vermont pine stand that where it's got one or two saw logs, and then the rest of it, you have an equal or greater amount of pulpwood in the top of the tree. It's really not available to anybody that's logging with a chainsaw. Rygate has traditionally purchased roundwood from conventional small loggers, pine pulp specifically, or rotten spruce and fir. At the moment, they're not, because they're stuffed. They bought a lot of softwood pulp after the J Main closed. That was wood that was intended to go there. That's a big deal to me. If you were, I was thinking about this, if you were to close the Rygate power plant today, I could probably list off 10 loggers, logging companies. These are multiple crew peoples in the woods with truck drivers that I suspect would go out of business pretty much immediately. It would have a pretty serious impact. The impact of the J Main, there's no stopping it. It's on its way. But if Rygate were to close as well, I think it would not be great, to be honest with you. The other comment, I understand that there's an argument to be made that mills like the Rygate power plant or Burlington Electric, they run at about 25% efficiency. And if you look at the boilers that are heating schools or municipal buildings, they're running at 85 or 90%. And so it's really attractive. The point, this may be the most important thing that I want to say to you, is that if you want chippers and live bottom trucks to feed your schools and your municipal buildings, which I think we all agree is a good idea, I think you need to make sure that you have a market for that chipper year round. These are expensive pieces of equipment. It takes labor and manpower to be able to get these schools the wood that they need. I don't see a scenario where if you don't have a Rygate or a Burlington Electric, that there's going to be the infrastructure to be able to feed your schools. And that's just my thought. I just don't think it makes sense to own a chipper for a market that exists 6 months a year. Okay. The other scenario too, fuel prices are just starting to come back up. In my opinion, fuel prices have been artificially low, and it's partly because of fracking. And I think fracking has hurt all the renewables, not just wood and biomass, but also solar and wind. And with fuel prices coming back up, I think that the value of Rygate is going to be better. It'll look more attractive. I realize that in the last 4 or 5 years, that it doesn't make economic sense. This is why New Hampshire is starting to close their plants. So I guess for me, there's a lot of things about the global economy that I'm frustrated with that we have no control on. The school wood market, the municipal wood market, which is a hardwood pulp market or a firewood market in the winter months only, has really evolved into a decent wintertime market in Vermont. I mean, there's a number of schools now, you know about them. I remember being in the U32 high school 25 years ago when I graduated college. And I remember that the head janitor telling me that U32, my alma mater, was saving $20,000 a month by burning wood instead of oil. It's like, yeah, that's common sense. Local wood, local use. I think Rygate and Burlington Electric fit into this picture for the logging community. And I worry that if we shut down, I guess at some point, I feel like subsidies are probably and absolutely worth it if we want to maintain a particular way of life. And the last concept that I want to put into your minds is that I would recommend that you call someone like Greg Chase, who is the wood buyer for Britain Lumber. And that's a white pine sawmill that used to exist in Fairleigh, Vermont. It burned about 5 years ago, and it moved to Bath, New Hampshire. But you could simply call Greg and ask him, what would it mean if the Rygate power plant shut down to his sawmill? And my guess is it would be devastating. because the product that they're using really does benefit to having a market that uses the poor portions of the tree.
Okay, Mr. Bradley, you've given us an awful lot of information and it's been very helpful because we haven't heard from this side yet. But correct me, what I believe I heard is we've had witnesses that say you should just leave all those branches and let them replenish the soil and let them rot.
Mhm.
I think I heard you say two things, which is that unless you have a market for the pulpwood, that there's an awful lot of forest in Vermont that it would not be economically feasible. You couldn't make enough out of the board feet you could get if you couldn't sell off the remains. And I think I also heard you say that the U32 Barrytown, do they take softwood pulp or did you say they take hardwood pulp?
Hardwood pulp.
Okay, that's what I thought I heard you say.
Basically firewood. It could be aspen. It could be species that you don't burn for firewood, like aspen or basswood or white birch, that's suitable for burning in those boilers. Back to the ecology part of this. I'm under no illusion that the forest is better off with humans. I think honestly, ecologically, having trees die in the woods and go back to the soil is absolutely that's perfect. The reality is that we're all consumers, but we also have interest in like recreation and aesthetics. It's reasonable to girdle 200 trees in your woodlot if you own enough land. Is it reasonable to girdle 2,000 trees in your woodlot? Pine pulp actually doesn't decompose all that quickly. It's got a lot of tannins in it. Maple actually rots way quicker than pine pulp. And so if you leave hundreds of cords of pine pulp on the forest floor, you're going to compete against some of those other interests, aesthetics, recreation. There's nothing wrong with wood going back in the soil. In certain scenarios, there could be a fire hazard. And we do, as a company, we do a fair bit of girdling. There's sites where I don't want to use whole tree equipment. It's too big, it's too heavy, the site's too wet, and we don't use that type of equipment, or maybe we don't even log at all. We do a certain amount of girdling and felling. I'm just afraid that this is going to continue so we've lost the amount of mill closures in my 25 years of forestry has been absolutely stunning. It's mill closure after mill closure after mill closure. And I think the loss of either Burlington Electric or Rygate, Vermont would also play a double on the few remaining sawmills that we have. And that basically we're on the cusp of losing our way of life. The reality is that leaving more pulp in the woods and more girdling and more felling of undesirable trees and just letting them rot is already starting to happen. To a degree. We're still trying to make the improvement work happen. My fear is that if we don't have markets for low grade wood, only the better quality wood is going to be harvested. That's what we call high grading, where the eventual quality of our forest from a timber point of view is just going to continue to decline. That's largely what happened before there were pulpwood markets in Vermont.
Sandra Hardy.
I can't hear you.
You're muted. There you go.
Trying to get myself to unmute and my mouse wasn't working. Mr. Bradley, thank you for your testimony. That last point you made, actually, I had not heard someone articulate before. So thank you for saying that about the low grading, I think you called it, of the
high grading.
High grading. Sorry, the opposite.
Right. Well, it's just a quick analogy. You can picture being a stockbroker, and if all you did was sell your best stocks, how successful would you be in the long term? And so the forestry world, we're trying to promote the best trees that we have until we feel like they're mature. So we're trying to get rid of the underperformers in just a very simple term, but that's just one way to look at it.
Okay, well, thank you. That was helpful. The point you made, and I've heard other people make this point, Commissioner Snyder, for example, and others, about if you cull out the lower grade pulpwood from a forest, it allows the higher grade wood to grow better, and we get better high grade wood. Is that measurable? Is there any, are you able as foresters to measure that? Do you measure the
Yeah, I mean, we
trees or something, or how is that measurable? Or is that just a thing that, I'm trying to figure out, is there science behind that, or is that just a feeling, if you know what I mean?
No, it's, if you look at some of our stands, we go from, say, a 50-year-old pasture, and you go into it and you take out 85% of the low quality trees and a few of the sawlog trees that have narrow forks or white pine blister us, and you've left those typically the medium-sized trees with good live crown proportions, and then typically you're waiting 20 years before you're back there again. So yeah, it's measurable. In the forestry plans, the term that we have, basal area per acre, you could also look at the board feet per acre, and you could definitely track the progress in some of these stands. Numerous stands that I've used whole tree harvest equipment to really kind of clean out the low quality stuff, and where somebody with a small piece of equipment, maybe even a horse logger if they existed, could log there without high grading the place in the future. It's really the goal.
Thank you.
In order to be in current use, you have to have a forest management plan. So that, to me, says that we think in this program, we have determined that that is of value. And you're saying part of that, to have a healthy forest, is to cull out the less healthy. Okay, I've got Senator McDonald and then Senator Bray. Senator McDonald.
That was interesting. The last question was interesting. I have a forest now that 45 years ago, the county foresters paid for folks like myself to go through and clear out, give a little room for other trees to grow, get rid of the forked trees. And it is a more valuable forest today, but that policy is no longer in place. But the notion of current use now makes it more profitable to do that culling on your own, because you're saving the money through taxes instead of getting a check from county foresters. But I had a question for the witness. Two questions. One was easy, was how many truckloads a day went to the place in New Hampshire that was closed?
You should fact check me on this, but I believe it's around 250.
Okay, and my understanding is that Rygate's about 30 truckloads a day.
I think so. Yeah. In the winter time, I think it's probably closer to 25 in the summer.
And,
Yep.
And Montpelier's district heat is 2 truckloads in the winter and 1 in the summer. And I only ask for those numbers to help the committee understand the proportional nature of things. We asked Commissioner Snyder last year, we haven't asked him yet this year, what's the plan for the 20% of hardwood ash that is not going to be here in 10 or 15 years, or you probably have a better estimate on how long it's going to take for that to just die and fall down. What's the state's plan for that forestry product, which is burnable and needs a market?
So I'll go back, Senator McDonald. I'll go back. If you want to just talk about ash real quick, I'll try to make this quick. Larger ash trees with saw logs are valuable. Small diameter ash trees that are just firewood are still not that valuable. Firewood is a low value product. Most of the cost of firewood is really labor and trucking. Here's how I see ash. A very small percentage of these ash trees are going to be resistant or tolerant. it's going to be in the vicinity of less than 1%. And
COVID.
hopefully it's more. So I read in my chestnut journal 3,000 years ago, hemlock pollen in the Northeast in the sediment cores disappeared. It took several hundred years, but hemlock restored itself to what it is today. So something showed up or evolved that thumped hemlock. I mean, the same thing's going on with beech, things going on with elm. And these species, there is natural resistance, there's natural tolerance, and these species are actively trying to work their way out of their problem. The time scale of these introductions are what's really kind of gnarly. We're going to see some horrible amounts of ash mortality. It's going to be replaced by whatever else is there. It'll be maple, maybe it's hemlock, maybe it's beech, maybe it's buckthorn. But the reality is, I don't think it doesn't make sense for us to cut every ash tree. We have to, I think it makes sense to harvest, at least as a person, an individual, to harvest the trees that are mature, that actually have value. But if they're not that valuable, I think it actually makes sense to leave them. And maybe they're going to be part of that percent that's going to help this species recover from this issue. This really boils down to, again, to consumerism. I mean, this is why I think it's important that we actually harvest wood in our backyards, because we're in this mess. We've been doing this for 1904 was the chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease. I mean, just list goes on and on and on. As we move stuff around the world, we're breaking ecological rules. And in my opinion, we use wood. We really don't have any business in Vermont bringing wood from anywhere else here, in my opinion.
Thank you. I was just wondering if that wasn't going to drive the price of ash down and still be of enough value to be burned, but your answer is probably not.
We've been leaning on ash as a company fairly hard for about 10 years. Yep. Mark, we've known this is coming, unfortunately. So.
Thanks for coming in.
Senator Bray.
Quick question. So 10 years ago, I was on a working group, biomass energy development working group. It's a mouthful. And one of the things that came out of that group was that it was so costly to be in the woods that you had to do an integrated harvest. So you were taking out pulpwood, you were taking out low-grade trees, and you were taking out high-quality wood because it wouldn't pay to be in there for any one thing. So each of them contributed to making it a successful financial endeavor. But are you saying now that the markets for that low-grade wood and the pulpwood are so poor that it's, instead of a modest but meaningful revenue stream, it's actually just a cost on top of being in there to get the better wood out that you're actually after?
Specifically softwood pulp, yes.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's changed, honestly. It's been this way for quite a while. Hardwood pulp or firewood is definitely more at the logger's cost of production, or traditionally.
Okay.
And if I remember correctly, from a workers' comp discussion we had, we've been trying to get the cost of workers' comp insurance for loggers down, but the way they're doing that is the bigger, more, not the guys with the chainsaws, but the guys in the enclosed cabs, which just, I'm assuming those larger vehicles cost more than a chainsaw. So we're pushing to become more mechanized.
Most of the chainsaw loggers are sole proprietors. Most of the mechanized crews, multiple people, all of them now carry workers' comp. It's very rare for a chainsaw crew to carry workers' comp. It's prohibitive.
Okay, and it's somewhere in the back of my mind, the paper plant, J plant in Maine, was that a new state-of-the-art plant? No. Okay. I just remember a conversation with a Maine legislator, and there was some.
The thing that's kind of a bummer about all this to me is that I started doing forestry 25 years ago. You want to fact check this as well, but yeah, there was in the vicinity of 20 paper mills in the state of Maine. I think there's probably 6 or 7 left now. But just recently, 5 years ago, I would have told you that pulp and paper was on its last legs. And just recently, it actually perked up a little bit. They actually restarted. Bill Sayre told me that they restarted the paper mill in Old Town, Maine, and they actually restarted the one in Bucksport, Maine. I didn't think mills got restarted once they shut down. But it's just really unfortunate that this digester blew up. I mean, the J plant is the one that and the Rumford plant are the ones that really saved everybody's bacon when the Berlin mill closed, 15 years ago.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Bradley? Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
We're going to move on to Chris Brooks. So
Thank you.
Chris, I've got you and Tabitha Bowling both. And I don't know if you've worked out a presentation or whatever.
Unfortunately, Tabitha had a medical appointment that she could not miss out.
Okay, we
So,
understand that.
I'm flying solo today.
Okay, well then just introduce yourself for the record and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Chris Brooks, and I'd like to thank you for hearing from me. I'm the owner and CEO of Vermont Wood Pellet Company. We are the only wood pellet company in the state of Vermont at this point. We are a softwood pellet company, so we take softwood pulp in. And kudos to Mark. 3 weeks ago, I was logging with horses with a twin team of Belgians. My family's been in this industry, in the logging industry, for about 5 generations. We've gotten in and out of various aspects of the timber industry. At this point, I'm the sole member of the family that has any connection at this point to the woods other than forest cropland that we have. About 4 years ago, we approached Rygate to talk to them about co-locating with them. At that point, it looked like with our efficiencies, we would be able to bring them up to an efficiency level that would get them the rec payments. Unfortunately, though, at that point, when we were talking to them, we realized they did not have a long-term contract. And secondarily, the day I went to see them, they weren't even running. We, on the other hand, we run 6 days a week, 24 hours a day, year round. We can't make enough. It's a total good news story. We have way more customers than we can absolutely supply. Tabitha and I have been looking to open a second mill for quite some time. If you remember, in the Northeast Kingdom, there was a mill that was just ready to go. We had to break ground, and unfortunately, what we discovered was the infrastructure there wasn't able to supply the electrical needs that we had. And for a $5 million project, $500,000 overrun for infrastructure was just a deal killer. That was sad, but true. We continue to look, and in this case, we would be happy to go talk to the folks at Rygate. We'd be happy to see if we can co-locate with them. We need to expand, and we want to expand in Vermont. If I had my druthers, there'd be 6 of these mills in Vermont. I wouldn't own them all because I went gray building the first one. I'm afraid what'll happen during the second one, but there should be more wood pellet mills. The demand is there. 2019 demand surpassed supply in New England. So this isn't just my company, it's all over. It's a viable industry. The challenge, though, with the industry is that it's like any fuel, it's a low margin. It's you're in it for the long term. You've got to be a patient investor. I probably could have done better in the market if I'd invested my money there instead of this, but my family's been in this business. We know the timber, we know the woods, and so we invest in that. And so here we are. I may have been logging a few weeks ago with horses, but I'm a cost accountant. That's what I do, and that's what we do. It's every day of the week. We do cost accounting, and as such, we would like to explore the possibility of Rygate. We're going to have to do a feasibility study and an audit, and I mean high level with electrical engineers, environmental engineers, mechanical, electrical. We're going to really need to be able to drill down to make sure it makes perfect sense to go in, but we're definitely interested. I agree that the low grade market is falling apart. It definitely is. We take in white pine. I work very hard never to close the gate, but we do have to regulate how many people can come in and deliver wood to our location. At this point, my wood yard is completely full. We are slowly bringing people in because there's a safety issue in the log yard, but we are bringing people in and continuing to buy. But there's definitely a need for low grade markets. I don't have a lot to say. If you've got any questions, I'd love to hear them.
And to let you know, Tabitha has joined us by phone.
Perfect. Tabitha, would you like to say anything?
Just a good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for the invitation. I'll catch up by listening and participate if it makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any Senator Bray?
Hi, Mr. Brooks. Good to see you again.
Good seeing you. It's been a while since we were on that board together 10 years ago.
Yes, yeah, and amazingly, we both don't look a day older.
Yeah,
Quite impressive. The question I have is, can you say a little bit about, there have been questions about whether or not Rygate would continue to operate, and I don't know if when you think about this is that what you're talking about replaces Rygate, complements Rygate. Is there a symbiosis there? Like, can you talk a little bit about how it might play out, and if it actually then, creates a bigger opportunity for Northeast Kingdom area loggers to deliver low grade wood?
Mm-hmm. The way we were discussing 4 years ago is that we would tap into their waste heat and take that waste heat and we'd use that to dry our chips. And we would then make those chips into wood pellets. The concept that I would have at this point is we would use their waste heat. We'd have to tap into their air quality measures. So that's definitely a big question. Can we do that? And are those able to withstand an additional amount? I don't know. That's why we'd have to have some environmental engineers. And I should add, to do these, feasibility study, there are funds available. It's not that, we have to ask anybody from the state to do this. There are funds available to do this. But our idea would be we would tap into their waste heat. We would bring in pulp. From that pulp, we would make 3 products. One would be obviously wood pellets. Another product would be compressed logs for the foreign market. And then the third item would be a dried chip for schools, which that's a direction that a lot of schools are moving toward, because to get your efficiency, you need to have a uniform moisture content for those chips. And so we would provide 3 separate materials for sales. But at this point, as I say, we need a feasibility study to see how we integrate with them and how it all works.
One other quick question is materials. So, sourcing. So I know that Vermont has a procurement standard, but Commissioner Snyder was talking about it as voluntary. I don't know if you know, or I just don't know what the rules are in terms of where wood comes from and the conditions under which it has to be harvested. And if that creates issues around Vermont, either voluntarily or under an obligation to harvest using more, I'll just call them careful practices that don't exist in New Hampshire, perhaps. That's what I've heard. And so that would usually more careful practice means more time and expense. And I don't know how that plays out in terms of what comes into Vermont if Vermont loggers supplying Vermont wood are going to be at a competitive disadvantage if they are bringing it to you or Rygate to anyone in Vermont.
So when we purchase, we have an open gate policy. So we're not a contractual purchaser. People bring pulp in without a contract. So we are pulling from about 104,000 acres of current use within 30 miles of our mill. We're a small enough user that we know who's practicing good quality logging techniques and who isn't. And we're very careful about that. And then sadly, there are some loggers that we will no longer take pulp from. But in the case of Rygate, I think maybe Marcus can speak to that, the actual rules that are put on the loggers. But from my perspective, it adds cost per ton to the Vermont folks. And sadly, it does not add cost per ton to the folks in New Hampshire, which in my opinion is probably not fair. And maybe potentially a jobs bill for New Hampshire and not Vermont. Is that true, Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, New Hampshire wood can flow freely to Rygate. But the people that are operating and sending to Rygate are going to have a contract. If they've got a chipper and a contract, Tyler Mousley is going to know who they are, and he's going to know the type of person or a contractor they are. Vermont jobs, every Vermont job, and sometimes it's difficult, in my opinion. The wildlife biologist put too much emphasis on deer yard, in my humble opinion. But every job that we send wood to Rygate is reviewed by the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. If there's any concerns about the nature of the cutting that we're going to do, they'll do a site visit. I think it's a pretty solid process. I think it actually keeps the really poor practices out of Rygate. For a long time, back when New Hampshire had plenty of chip plants, in my opinion, the bad logging shipped their wood to New Hampshire. The good logging shipped their wood to Vermont, to Rygate or Burlington Electric.
I would add that I think, in the current market, I think any marginal logger is probably out of business already. I mean, I really, the guys who are probably cutting corners, I don't know how you feel about this, but the guys who are cutting corners are probably out of business at this point. You've got to have have to have everything together to really be able to make it work.
Okay, I got a quick question for you, Chris.
Sure.
You've just made my day by saying that there's not enough pine pulp facilities for your product. I think that sounds lovely, but the question that I would have, let's just imagine that the Rygate site is actually a good one, that you do your studies and it makes sense to combine with Rygate and have a dual mill at that facility. What's the time frame? How long would it take to actually be operating in Rygate, Vermont?
Outside 2 years.
2
It
years.
depends on how long the feasibility study takes, to be honest.
Okay.
And I'm a little hesitant because in this market, I've never seen a market like this for goods. We ordered, we have to order a new chipper for our outside, and it's 150 days before that chipper's coming in. Previously, that would have been a chipper that I could have ordered, and it would have been here in a month and a half. So it's a very strange market we're in, a strange climate we're in. But I think depending on how quickly we can do a feasibility study, probably 2 years.
Mr. Brooks, what I heard, because the question before this committee is whether or not we extend Rygate's license. And what I heard you say is you wouldn't really be a replacement for Rygate. You would co-locate, you would use their heat, which we know is, but you would also need access to the to the electricity. If Rygate shut down, I don't know how much electricity would be available in that area. I do know it's very rural and very isolated, and you might not have the power supply there that you'd need. So you need two things. You need heat and you need a power supply. And if you have to generate the heat, that adds, I assume, to your costs. You would have to set up a way to dry your chips. Okay.
We actually at this mill, we've worked very hard to extricate ourselves from fossil fuels. So we dry our chips using wood, and quite honestly, we could produce more if we didn't do that, if we used fossil fuels, but that's not why we're in this. So we do use our heat. Your question is one that I wouldn't want to be on this board with you guys. I give you guys all the credit in the world. As a cost accountant kind of person, I just, or as we used to say, oofta. Yes, I need electricity, but I will tell you, next to pulp, electricity is also my most expensive bill. And so it's got to be at the right price. I can't, I'm
Okay.
there.
So you've got us, you put your finger on what our issue is. That
I can't help you there, but I can tell you that I hate to see so many logs going north. You sit on the interstate there and watch how many logs go north of the border. And it's because Gas Metro Power provides a very cheap, electricity north of the border. It puts us at a competitive disadvantage. I mean, I'm paying about 12 cents kW here at this mill that I'm sitting at. I've got competitors that are paying 8. That's a huge difference, especially for my second highest expense. So it's tough, really tough.
I've been told that Canada has low corporate taxes and electricity. That's, my son lives there. Too cheap to meter.
I will tell you one thing. Taxes, we've explored New Hampshire. Taxes are almost exactly the same between New Hampshire and Vermont for business.
I know they have higher property taxes.
So there you go.
Okay, Senator Pearson. And Senator Hardy, I see your yellow hand. You moved. I had you down here.
Once you put your yellow hand up, it moves you into the upper left corner or something.
Okay, well, I got Senator Pearson, and then we'll go to you, because.
Go for it, Chris.
All right, thank you. Chris, I love hearing from you. I met you a few years ago in Senate Ag, and very similar story. I appreciate what you're doing for all sorts of reasons. I guess a couple of questions. The idea of complementing Rygate and using the heat and co-locating, and therefore, I think we would probably gain efficiency, at least for the portion of the electricity you're taking, because it doesn't have to travel, is interesting and part of the discussion. But there is also the consideration of, could we find a different way of promoting the wood products industry and sort of replacing Rygate? And so can you give us a sense of the scale? I think Rygate testified that they're using 250,000 tons a year. What are you looking at? Just, it's hard for me to conceive of that, but are you a quarter of that or 3 times that, or what's your plant dealing with now?
So the mill that I'm sitting at, we're at 45,000 a year.
Okay.
When we built this mill, we did a study of what does Vermont want, and they, I was working and I cut my teeth down in Georgia selling pellets overseas. That's a 100,000 ton facility, and I would have invested in grown it up to almost 200,000 ton facility. When I came up here, did the study, Vermont wants community scale. And so we scaled the mill to be a maximum of about 20,000 tons. We actually produce around 15,000 tons a year here. The wood we buy is about 45,000 tons at this specific mill. At the Rygate facility, again, I have to do feasibility study because I have to see what the forest recharge area is and what can it sustain with the 2 mills together or standalone. I would prefer drawing everything that I need within a 50-mile radius would be nice. It's better for everybody. So I hate to keep falling back on the feasibility study, but I also need to know their scrubbers. We'd have to tap into that. What capacity do those scrubbers have for air quality? Those are all things, if you give me the green light, we can build a mill that's going to take close to what they're taking now. It'll be a different wood though. So that's the challenge. We'd have to make sure that we're not being a strain on the forest there. So I probably haven't answered your question. It's just like you. We've got a lot of different things working at the same time to be able to answer it honestly and truthfully.
And then what about just technically, you talk a lot about wanting to do the analysis, and of course that's prudent, but we know that Rygate has to be shut for part of the year. That's been true since it's been open. I gather a month off a year, something like that is what they've testified. Is that a non-starter, or do you just suck down from the grid if that has to be the case?
We probably suck down. It depends on everybody's corporate culture and the way you do things. We run 6 days a week. On the 7th day, we do maintenance. We shut down and do planned maintenance. Throughout the year, we may have 2 weeks out of the year that we've got to shut down and do something on planned maintenance. But the way we explain it is that the plane takes off Sunday night, and we try and work until Saturday at noon or so, and the plane doesn't touch down again. Ideally, I'm buying a new chipper because I was down for a week because my old chipper broke down last week. That's just part of it. But if we need to go to grid, we go to the grid. It makes sense because we've just got so many customers that we just can't supply. I can't. If you call me and ask me if I'll take you on as a dealer, I can't, because I can't supply the dealers I have.
Thank you.
So we got to run. Tabitha, do you have anything to add to that? I'm not hearing from her.
Doesn't look like it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Any last questions? Senator Hardy.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions. This is a really nice theoretical conversation that we're having, but my understanding is that, and we can hear maybe directly from the Rygate people, but they're not in negotiations or conversations with you about this at all, as far as I understand, right? This was an idea that we, or one of our committee members thought of, and invited you in. So that's lovely to hear all this, but I unless you have different, or Dylan or whomever has different information, this is just a theoretical conversation. And is that correct? I see you nodding.
It is correct. I mean, I was called into this conversation a week ago.
Understood. I'm not criticizing. I'm just
No, that's all right.
pointing that out. And then we also got testimony, I believe, from the DEC about the emissions sort of standards or issues with creating pellets, the process of making wood pellets. One of my concerns, and I think others on the committee's concerns, are the sort of environmental impact of the Rygate plant and whether we want to continue along this path. Pellets were offered as an alternative, but then we were told, I believe, that creating pellets also creates quite a bit of emissions. And I wondered if you could speak to that briefly.
Definitely. So, it's a bigger issue than that. There is no good thermal source for heating in the winter. I mean, there really isn't a good alternative. We have to stay warm. And we could have a different conversation about, we should do like the upper Mississippian culture and move south every winter and then come back north to the land here. But, population concentration pollution is just as bad. So we have to stay warm. And it may sound funny that, I'm in the heating business, but I'm telling you that there's just no good option. When people ask, just like you have, I tell them flatly, insulate your house. You need to insulate. And they come by, and they come by pellets, but use them sparingly. That heat is a precious commodity, and you should treat it as such. I am incredibly proud of what we've done here, how we've worked with, the state of Vermont. And everything about what we do here, I'm incredibly proud. But it is a thermal source, and we're burning something. So, that's what we have to consider is just that. And it's why I say, in looking at co-locating, one of the first people that you call is an environmental engineer. Does it make sense? How do we go as clean as we can? And I have to admit, there's two ways to make pellets. There's one way where you just burn that wood and dry it as quickly as you can and as hard as you can. And then you add water to it to bring it to a certain moisture content where you can make a pellet from it. Or you can take that wood and you can carefully dry it. And in doing so, you hold all the volatiles that make a good pellet. And that's what we try and do. We work really hard. We don't add water. We dry it just to where we need it, no more. And in doing so, we make a better pellet than anybody else. There are financial reasons to do that. I'm not the cheapest pellet on the market, but I produce 15% more energy with my pellets because I don't dry it down to a point where those volatiles are all flashing off. So, but it's important to work with the environmental engineers to figure out how to do that properly. So that's my take. It's tough. Again, it's like you guys, it's a tough decision.
I'm got a note from Faith that we have 5 more witnesses. I think some of them are double, but I want to thank you because this has been very helpful. And the massive failures in the electric grid, and it sounds like everything west of the Mississippi this past day or two. There's been a couple things popping up in the news about making us perhaps rethink making everything electric, single source, because we have very unpredictable weather. And we may find ourselves having to deal with things we haven't dealt with. I know that the ice storm in Quebec, I saw the high tension lines and they were bent in half. It was a major damage from that storm. So things to consider. So I'm going to move along. I have Dylan Zwicky and Bill Harrington, and Bill is the new owner of. So Bill, maybe we can get you Chris Brooks' contact information if you want to talk to him. But Dylan, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will, in the interest of time and recognize that the committee is a little short on it with additional witnesses.
No, you've got all the time you need. I may have to go to a chair's meeting, but the committee can go on.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll keep my remarks short so that you can get on to asking Bill any questions about the bill or the plant. There are three things that I would just note for the committee. First and foremost, with respect to the earlier discussion today about forest harvesting practices, there was some language added in the to S190 last year that directs the PUC to basically look at and consider suggestions from the Agency of Natural Resources in terms of potentially updating the harvesting practices that are in place at the plant. The original CPG for Rygate includes harvest standards for all jobs that are performed in Vermont. My understanding from the forester at Rygate, Tyler, who was referenced by previous witnesses, is that in addition to the jobs that he reviews in Vermont and that are overseen by Fish and Wildlife here in the state, he also reviews through a similar lens jobs that are come from New Hampshire. So there is a level of review for any jobs that do take place in New Hampshire. It's not just like that wood is coming and we have no idea how it's been harvested or where it's been harvested. There is oversight from Tyler for all of those jobs. And that language was included at the suggestion of both VNRC and Audubon Vermont. So the PUC in developing the contract for the next 10 years will take that into account and potentially impose new revise the harvest standards that are in place for wood that would go to Rygate. The second is that I've submitted some language to the committee, which is posted on the webpage that addresses it basically amends the amendment that Luke Martland had presented to the committee on February 11th, the last time that this committee took up the bill. The amended language deals with this question of the feasibility of taking the excess heat generated by the plant. As the committee, some members of the committee may recall, the bill S190, as it passed the Senate last year, basically directed the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to study the issue of heat and produce a report on what the state of Vermont what steps the state of Vermont might take to be able to find an off-taker for that excess heat. After the bill passed the Senate, ACCD approached us and indicated that the combination of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that they didn't feel like they had the in-house expertise to be able to perform that study put them in a position where they couldn't support that language. We went back to the drawing table, we spoke with Bill and came up with this alternate language that directs the owner of the plant to conduct their own feasibility analysis, submit that to the Department of Public Service, and then have DPS do their own review in concert with ACCD and provide recommendations to the committees of jurisdiction on additional steps that could be taken. We shared that language with some of the other stakeholder groups, and the language that's on your page today under my name, the language that's highlighted in yellow, was included at the recommendations of VNRC and Audubon Vermont. And essentially the language provides some additional beefing up and acknowledgement that it is in the interest of the state of Vermont to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and in turn increase the efficiency of the Rygate plant. Secondarily, it moves up some of the dates for which those reports are due. The owners would be required to submit their feasibility analysis to the Department of Public Service by October 15, 2022. And then the department would need to submit their recommendations to the legislature by 2023. So we try to take into account the recommendations of those stakeholders. And then finally, I did just want to put a plug in. I know that Commissioner Porter has some substitute language for the bill back provisions in the bill that allow his department to bill back to the owners of Rygate for the costs associated with the review of those harvest jobs. There was some language included in the bill S190 and in S1 as introduced. My understanding from conversations with Commissioner Porter is that the substitute language works better for his department. We're fully supportive of that replacement language and would appreciate the committee considering replacing that language to include Commissioner Porter's recommendations. And I spoke with the commissioner earlier today, and I know that he would be willing to come in and speak to the exact impact of that substitute bill back language.
Okay, that's been the least of our problems at this point. So
Understand.
little things like bill backs.
So that's what I have.
Okay.
I did just want to, if it's okay with the committee, give an opportunity for Bill Harrington to speak to some of the points that were raised by the previous witness about potentially co-locating a pellet facility on the Rygate property.
Okay, Mr. Harrington, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here and very happy to hear Mr. Brooks talk about co-locating, because that's really our highest and best goal in every one of our plants, is to find somebody that can co-locate and take waste heat. Very, very happy to reach out and get contact information and meet with Mr. Brooks, and very excited about the prospect and opportunity. Secondly, I'd echo what Dylan said, is we try to do with having Tyler on board as a forester. He does examine everything that comes into the Rygate plant, at least from the standpoint of harvesting plants. And I've been with him on a road tour where we went and met with several of the people that supply the Rygate plant, and he's very conscientious about making sure that people do it the right way, which is what we want. The only other point I would say is the chair brought up the fact that we do have volatile weather. I grew up at the oil patch in Midland, Odessa, Texas. Wasn't born there, but my dad was a pipeline welder. And this past weekend, West Texas has been blessed with having a lot of wind, and it drove power prices down to where they were pretty negligible during some parts of the year. But this past weekend, with the cold weather, their spot power prices got to more than $9,000 per megawatt hour. And they've been in excess of $5,000 per megawatt hour on a fairly regular basis over a few days. My brother still lives in Midland, and I think they had 0-degree weather today. But I think that biomass serves a very good purpose for adding some baseload renewable capacity to any kind of portfolio. I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee would have.
Okay, committee. Wow. Okay, Sandra Pearson.
Mr. Harrington, I think it's, am I right that you own other similar facilities in Maine and New Hampshire?
That is correct.
And do you own any of the ones that have not been relicensed? Because as I understand it, that has been the case in other states, but I don't pretend to be expert in that.
Every one of our plants have all Title V permits, all NPDES permits, and have the ability to operate.
Okay, so the plants that have been there have been wood-fired electric plants in Maine and New Hampshire that have not been relicensed, but those aren't the ones you own.
They are not the ones we own. There have been some that have been shut down by people, but we have maintained air quality and water permits at every one of our plants. They all have interconnect agreement, and they can operate. That's not our plants.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Just to
follow up on what Senator Pearson was asking. So I may get these town names wrong. Is it West Enfield and Jonesboro, Jonesport? Are those plants your plants in Maine?
West Enfield and Jonesboro are our plants in Maine, yes.
Yeah. And are they currently in operation?
They're both generating right now.
Yeah, okay. And we were talking about a schedule that shutdowns during part of the year. Is that the way, is that common for all the plants? I mean, is that how the main plants operate, that generally you're off for the summer months or something like that? What's your experience been so far?
Well, our experience has been that, you know, unlike the Rygate plant, if you have a plant that is quote unquote a merchant plant, you know, the biggest competitor to baseload generation is natural gas. And when natural gas prices get so low that generation prices get low, unless you're willing to contribute a few $1 million per plant to the ratepayers of Isono, England, you run them during the period of the year where power prices are sufficient that it'll cover the cost and make a reasonable profit.
Sure.
So what we've done in some of those plants, they are generating now. You know, we may run them 1 month in the summer, 2 months in the winter, and then hunker down in between and try to survive on capacity payments.
Okay. So then you just bid into the ISO New England market when you see a favorable pricing period.
We are responding to RFPs that the state of Maine is coming out with for, I believe, power purchase agreements that'll last for about 20 years. We are bidding into that process.
Okay. Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Donald, yes.
I'm bidding into the process for selling spot market electricity or baseload electricity. Which was it?
The RFPs that are coming out are for baseload electricity.
Which is year round, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so that means you operate in the fall and the spring, just like the winter and the summer.
Yes, that is correct. It would be similar to the Rygate PPA, that if there is a power purchase agreement that has a fixed price year round, we would run base load except for scheduled outages, typically spring and fall.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to Alan Robertson. Mr. Robertson, there you are. Okay. Welcome, and just introduce yourself for the record, and then the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify. My name is Alan Robertson. I'm a private landowner in Sheffield, Vermont, secretary of Vermont Woodlands Association. We are the organization for private forest landowners in Vermont, and we take great pride in the fact that we do sustainable, well-managed forestry. We have about 1,000 members. And this talk about Rygate is very, very important to us. I'm a retired engineer, by the way, so it's very interesting to hear the very, very good comments and very good testimony I've heard so far from foresters and from the Rygate people. But from the forestry standpoint, from the private landowner standpoint, when we're trying to do good forestry, as has been previously mentioned by Marcus and several others, there's a lot of stuff out there in the woods that a logger has to move in order to get any kind of a economic business going. I think one thing that I heard that is kind of scary is I don't think there's a true understanding of just how much coarse woody debris there is out there in our forests. The Vermont forests have come back, but in general, those forests were beat up pretty badly for many, many decades, centuries. And the people that are now managing them, that want to make them better, are dealing with a quality of wood out there that leaves a lot to be desired. So in the effort to salvage good wood and remove the lower quality, you have to take a lot of that out. There's a tremendous volume. I think the idea that maybe we're putting stress on the forest by taking this wood out really misses the point. I don't think taking 250,000 tons of wood out of Vermont forest is difficult whatsoever. Just knowing what I've had to take out on my property. The good news is that once it's out of there, that allows a lot of new stems to come in and potentially planting to increase the quality. And that continuing effort means that you have a lot less low quality wood, hopefully sometime in the future. But right now in Vermont, that's not the case. There is a lot of low quality wood. And you don't have to take every bit of it. We leave a lot of that coarse woody debris in the wood. So even taking a fraction of that, there's still a tremendous volume of low quality wood to get rid of. And that's incredibly important to do the work that we want to do, because a forester has to take some of that out in order to attract a logger to come in and get the rest of it. You're not wanting to high grade. You really want a low grade, but make it a little bit more interesting by providing some truly decent saw logs. The bottom line is that most of the stuff that logger is going to take out is going to be low quality, at least in this generation that we are in now. Maybe 50 to 100 years from now, it will be better. But if I'm wanting to do good forestry on my land, I'm going to have that guy come in general to do low grading, and he's got to do something with it. I had a small logging job done this summer, and unfortunately, I ended up having to be the marketer for the last load of pulp because there was just no way for the logger to find a place to get rid of it. I was lucky to get the guy. He didn't make any money and I didn't make any money, but I at least got rid of enough of the stuff that was there from a storm that I can start over again and do the right thing. I think it's incredibly important for forest landowners that want to do good forestry, for the logging people to keep their jobs, for us to keep a biofuels market or industry in this state for the future, that this plant is an incredible asset and very important, even if it's not the latest technology. We commented on that last year when we provided a testimony. Yeah, this is an older plant. Modifying that plant is difficult. And as Chris said, and as Marcus alluded to, we ought to have a lot of these plants. The technology for that is called combined heat and power. And that's what I think Chris was referring to. Unfortunately, those plants are expensive. And in Vermont, they have to go through 2 levels of permitting. They have to go through the 148 and they have to go through Act 250. The chances of building those is very slim. It would be nice to have. We'd like to see that in the future. But right now, the only show in town is Burlington Electric Department and the Rygate plant. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but if we're going to have a biofuels industry, if we're going to have good forestry, and if we're going to keep enough loggers around to help us do that good forestry, this plant is essential. And I'll get off my soapbox now.
Okay, Senator Hardy.
Thank you. Mr. Robertson, thank you for being here. Just a quick question. You're a private landowner. Do you log your own land or do you hire somebody to do it for you? I'm just trying to get a sense of where you are in the food chain.
Very good question. I'm a little bit of an anomaly. I spent my 20s in Germany and I got really into forestry over there as an engineer working at a military base. When I came back, I bought my 60 acres and I have been playing the game of doing forestry the way the Germans do it. It's called Dauerwald. It's ecological forestry. That's not to take away from the conventional forestry that goes on in Vermont. And in fact, yes, I do. I hire, actually, Marcus is my forester. But based on his advice, I generally do my own logging, but I hired a logger this summer because As we've talked about on the weather and the soil conditions on my land mean that I get a lot of blowdowns. And I had been wet nursing this parcel or this stand for 20 years. And this year nature said, no, I'm going to deal with it. And a lot of it got flattened. So rather than, I'm 72 and I wanted to spend more time doing good forestry than just plain logger, I hired a logger to come in and clean up the mess from the storm. That's in a way, the good news, because now I have about 2 acres of land that's free of all of the storm damage and all the problems and all of that low quality wood. It was all low quality wood. And I can go in and I can do what we call resiliency planning. I'm putting species in the ground that are from southern Vermont, not northern Vermont where I'm from. And the idea there is that I'm taking into consideration how the climate will probably change over the next few decades. So I do a little bit of everything. And I have been a logger. I have a trucker though that deals with getting what I harvest to a mill. I have a forester, but I try and be pretty much a one-man show here. 60 acres.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Not seeing anything. Oh, Senator Bray. Senator Bray, there you go.
My quick question is, you were saying the woods in Vermont have been pretty well beat up for a while. So does that mean a lot of heavy cuts, a lot of high grading? What's pretty beat up mean?
Well, as Marcus said, high grading is an anecdotal term that refers to basically cheating the landowner. You're going in and you're taking out the best trees. On the other hand, you could call it what you hope most landowners are practicing in Vermont would be low grading, which is to go in, make it worth the logger's while to go in and clean out a lot of the lower grade, but give him enough of the decent logs to make it worth his while and maybe give you a little bit of money. Most of the early forestry operations that a landowner would have to do on his land require an awful lot of low grading just to establish a platform that you can work from and improve on. Once you get beyond that, when you've had a woods under management for many decades, then you get more into, well, you know, a lot of my trees are of a better grade. You're going to have a lot less low quality wood. That's rare in Vermont right now, at least up here in the Northeast Kingdom. They have been beat up, and in all honesty, the weather doesn't help. We have seen a lot more storms that cause a lot more damage, and I've been cleaning up from one storm 10 years ago that I still find trees down from. But I think that answers your question. So high grading really isn't what we're doing out here.
No, sorry, I don't think I asked it very clearly. So you were saying the woods have been beat up for a period of time. I'm asking you, what were people doing that made them become beat up?
I agree.
They were high grading.
Right.
That was generally before World War II.
Yeah.
That was and in the maybe the up into the 50s. There finally got to be a period of time, I want to say in the 50s and 60s, when that realization took hold, and we started to see rules, AMPs, regulations, and we also have the science of forestry, silviculture, that has improved immeasurably, and we have a lot of much better foresters that realize that there are better ways to manage than they used to. Marcus is a good example of that.
Thank you.
Questions? Thank you. This has been good information today. I'm going to move on to Ed Larson. There you are.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I haven't seen you in a while, Ed.
We're only a block apart.
I know.
Well, anyways, thank you very much, Madam Chair and committee, for allowing me to testify on this bill. I'm Ed Larson. I'm the lobbyist for the Vermont Forest Products Association. I did testify on the S-190 last year, but I didn't have to follow such a good act last year. I can cut my testimony a little bit short since you've gotten a great lesson about forestry and forest management and silviculture from a couple of experts. But I do want to open by thanking Harrington for making an investment in the Vermont forest products industry. I also want to thank Mr. Brooks for making that investment 8, 10, 15 years ago, and is thinking about making an additional one. I think I speak for the industry when I say that we would love to see 3 more biomass plants and 3 more pellet plants in Vermont scattered around so that we would have good markets for our low-grade softwood pulp. I too am a consulting forester. I've been doing that for about 35 years. Before that, I owned my own sawmill business. Struggled with that, but I've been in the woods. I don't have near as many clients as Marcus, because half my time is spent doing what I'm doing right now, working with the industry, representing them before you. But I'm out there. I am in the 60-mile radius of Rygate with most of my clients. A lot of my loggers who have chippers do send their material to Rygate and would be woefully lost if Rygate wasn't there. To your question, Senator Harvey, and even Al Robertson was going there too a little bit in his last remarks about high grading and how do you know whether we're not doing that anymore? How do you measure it? Before the current use program, we were high grading quite a bit. It was more like a 1-to-1 ratio of saw timber to pulp. When current use came into effect and management plans were being written and documented and more formalized, by the mid-90s, and the Department of Forest and Parks Recreation was tracking this, our pulp to saw log ratio was 3-to-1. And I think we're still somewhere in that area, 3-to-1, 2.5-to-1 in the amount of pulp we're extracting compared to saw timber. But if we lose Rygate, and I'm afraid the J plant is going to play out a little bit in Vermont too. I think Marcus has a pretty good pulse on what he sees happening in the future. High grade could become a modum operandi again. I have had jobs where I've seen my logger literally drive his skidder right by a pocket of low-grade balsam fir. And I asked him to cut it because I want to get it out of the way. He said, I've got no market for it. I'm just going to take the saw logs and leave the pulp. Well, he didn't stay on the job very long. But that's the propensity, the desire that you're going to see increase if we can't figure out a fix for softwood pulp. And plus we need more loggers. So they need to be able to make it pay. I don't want to, I talked all about all of the issues around the plant last time. I support the language you have in the draft, the first draft as introduced, which was what you passed last year. Most of the changes I have been able to track, I'm okay with at this point. The only one I'm concerned about is the bill back provision for fish and wildlife. I couldn't find that language. I need to review that. My only concern there is there should be a finite amount. You should know what that amount is, because it could become an open book for the department. That's one of the concerns I have about back billing. I'd rather it was a set fee if you're going to do that at all. Keep in mind that it's not the landowner's benefit or the logger's benefit that they are doing this. It is for the benefit of the state. So you're asking the private concerns to pay for things that benefit the state. It's not the first time that happens, but I just want to make that point. So other than that, thank you very much for the opportunity. You'll hear from me again if indeed things change, but at this point, we support the bill and hope that you carry it forward as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Ed? Senator Bray.
Hi, Mr. Larson. Good to see you again. So as you know, legislators get questions from all sorts of people with all sorts of views on whatever we're talking about. And so I have heard from a fair number of people who just wish we wouldn't burn what's coming out of the woods, period, right? Particulates, that by the time you recapture that carbon in the next tree, we're on an 80 or 100-year cycle, and climate change is so pressing a need to address that they wish we would do something, that we wouldn't do more of this. So I have a very genuine question, which is, for low-grade wood, is there another use that you're aware of that doesn't involve burning it? I don't know, manufactured timbers or oriented strand board, or I don't know what goes into what, but are there ways to use it as a building product, for instance, or insulation or packaging? Who knows?
Yes, to all of that, but it requires a considerable amount of investment and manufacturing. Aspenite is a word that you may have heard of, or wafer boards. There are plants around the country that buy certain specific species. Aspen comes to mind and has the fiber characteristics and print properties that are excellent for gluing them together and making a very solid panel. We can go into a lot of different types of composite products. I've seen pallets made out of pressed wood. There's all kinds of things, but all of them require investment. All of them require a plant. Hey, I'm for having all of them here in the Northeast, but we need to make it attractive for them to want to do that. And economic, it's all economics. You had a great little thing of microeconomics from Mr. Bradley. Same thing applies, and Mr. Brooks is talking about it in the manufacturing process too. But yes, there are some alternatives, but this is what we have. And this is all we're going to get for a while. It's going to be years before this turns around. We need every 250,000, 45,000 ton buyers we can find.
Okay, and at that, I'm going to move us along because we've got one more witness in about 7 minutes. So I'm going to move us along to Darren Springer. And there's Darren. And I think we had you here because you are the other big wood chip burning plant in the state. And just, there's been concern about the cost of wood biomass and the impact on rates, and just wondering, how is the rate structure up at Burlington Electric set up? What keeps you burning biomass? Are there other alternatives out there? And where do your chips come from? Where do you get your fuel?
Sure, happy to answer that. Darren Springer, General Manager with Burlington Electric. We operate the McNeil biomass plant on behalf of the McNeil joint owners, which is 50% Burlington Electric, 31% Green Mountain Power, 19% Vermont Public Power Supply Authority, which is the other municipal utilities, number of them. We have been running the plant since 1984 as part of Burlington's move away from coal. The McNeil generating plant was built as a renewable facility to replace the Moran coal plant. We get wood chips. We use mostly residues, as I gather. I haven't been on the entire time, but I gather that's been discussed in terms of low grade, low value residues that are left over from higher value operations is the vast majority of the wood chips that we get at the plant. Most of them come from a 60-mile radius of the facility. So 2019, for example, we purchased wood in 8 different Vermont counties, as well as some wood from New York and Quebec. We have 4 professional foresters on staff at McNeil that help manage sustainability of our forestry operations, making sure that we harvest from sites that are managed, that have a plan, that promote the appropriate environmental standards. We've invested with the joint owners in emissions reduction equipment that helps keep the different air emissions low at the facility. And we also, when you look at McNeil, it's now the largest energy producer in the state of Vermont now that Vermont Yankee has closed. And we're a 100% renewable utility. We have all different resources in our portfolio, including hydropower, solar, and wind that we get electricity from. But the McNeil plant is an important plant, not only as an energy producer, but it also is one of the limited number of facilities, I think, in Vermont that can actually support the grid. during times of need in a way that other resources sometimes cannot. I'll stop there. I know there may be other questions. Hopefully that was a helpful intro.
Is biomass, how does it rate in cost? Could you buy, would your rates be lower if you replace biomass with more solar?
No. I think I can categorically say no to that. Biomass is for us, we looked at this, I'm going to refer to the 2019 year because we did some deep analysis of this with a third-party firm for our integrated resource plan in 2019. You could look at biomass from McNeil as being the equivalent of purchasing about 10.5 cent per kilowatt hour power. And although we sometimes can find wind contracts that might be kind of competitive with that price, we typically don't get solar at that price. And we obviously have a significant amount of hydro in our portfolio as well. But when you're looking at renewable resources, that's reasonably competitive. And we try to have a mix of different renewable resources, not put all our eggs in any one basket.
Do you use the heat you generate in some way?
There's been a 30+ year process looking at district energy in Burlington. And we actually just announced on February 8th with partners, including University of Vermont Medical Center, Vermont Gas, Evergreen Energy out of Minnesota, and the city of Burlington and Burlington Electric, that we have taken the latest iteration of the district energy proposal to what we're calling phase 3. We have a letter of intent that was signed by all of those parties and a 3 to 6 month work plan that's intended to take us to a point where we can make potentially binding commitments, if everybody is on board, to advance the district energy proposal, which would capture waste heat and additional steam from McNeil and utilize it to offset fossil fuel use in the city of Burlington, potentially reducing greenhouse gas emissions in that sector by around 11.5% for the commercial sector.
Okay. Senator Bray.
Hello, Mr. Springer. I'm wondering how other states treat your RECs. If I don't know if you're over a threshold, or are you able to sell higher quality RECs out of state? And we were talking about REC arbitrage earlier with the department and the value that has to ratepayers. Is that something that you and your partners can do with McNeil?
McNeil is qualified as a Connecticut high value REC. There is a market for that. McNeil is qualified there because of a $12 million investment made in emissions reduction equipment that makes the plant qualified to offer RECs in Connecticut. That was made in 2008. So I guess the answer to your question is yes.
Can you say what that contributes to the bottom line for BED customers?
Well, based on state policy, if you're able to sell those RECs, I believe in Connecticut, the cap on the value of those is at $40 a megawatt hour. You're obviously not going to sell them all the time at that level. You may be selling at a lower level. But REC revenues is an important component of our revenue base. And in a given year, it could range from 7-8 million up to 13 million. That's all REC revenues, not just McNeil. And for Burlington Electric, we typically have a $55 to $60 million budget. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what the REC revenue range is relative to the overall budget.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, thank you, Mr. Springer. You've been hanging with us for a while. Committee, some of us have to leave. I have been instructed to ask you for one question. Next Tuesday, we're having a joint hearing on weighting, pupil weighting, not obesity. And if anyone has any witnesses that they'd like, this is a joint hearing with Senate Education, just let us know. Senate Ed is taking the lead on this, but they have asked if we have any witnesses we'd like to hear from. So if you have any, let Faith know and we'll get it in the works. And at that, thank you all. Tomorrow,
Madam
we are going back, well, it's Housing and Conservation Coalition, so they're coming in. We're going to do some more on the E911 deficit. The PPP double dipping, the tax linking, and what committee discussion for the week's agenda, the next week's, and then those right of ways and what the Agency of Transportation is doing about charging utilities. And we're going to start focusing, because we need to know by next Tuesday how we would like to spend that 3.2 million that's in still sitting in the department. And we have the commissioner coming in on Thursday. And then we still, I believe, have S80, which we're going to do our walkthrough on Friday. I've taken that out and we'll hammer it out with a committee structure. The governor discussion. The governor has also made some proposals in the budget for how to use money that he's put in the budget, but they include things like pole harvesting, line extension assistance. And so just be thinking about, I think it'd probably, just looking at the bills, would be the consumer assistance for the line extension and pole harvesting, which I know is vitally important to the CUDs because they can't string any wire until they do it. So we will have that discussion. And anything else you would like at this point? Sandra Hardy.
Yeah, thank you. I see that Luke is at least here by name only. I don't know if he's still behind that, but today in our testimony and other times when we've talked about S1, there's been references made to various amendments. And I know, Luke, you walked us through one, but it was as a separate amendment. And I was wondering, the next time we get back to S1, if we could see a strike all with highlighted amendments, just so I can understand where we're at with amendments. Especially Mr. Zawicki has referenced a whole bunch of them, and I can't keep track of what the language is and where they are. And it's not to say that we're going to agree to all the amendments, but just so we can have a visual of them, it would be helpful.
There's two proposed changes to the document that we looked at last week. One is the bill back language, and the second is Dylan's changes to that section of the amendment you looked at last week. Both raise legal issues you should consider before you make a decision.
Okay.
So I can brief you on those legal issues at any time, and then depending what you decide, I would incorporate those into a new amendment with any other changes you may have.
Okay, but the amendment that you walked us through last week, you did as a separate amendment, not as a strike all or
Integrated, yeah.
amendment, right? Because
Okay.
That is accurate, yes.
Okay, it'd be helpful just the next time we get to this, and not now, but to have it sort of.
I'll defer to whatever the committee wants. The committee hasn't made any decisions yet.
Right.
The only reason I did that was to speed up the process, and I don't know if it was helpful. So maybe it's good to talk through each of them and you guys decide what you want or don't want. And then I would incorporate them however you want, either amendment or strike all, whatever you prefer.
Okay.
But I feel like there's a lot of balls in the air right now, and it's up to you to decide which balls you want to catch.
Yeah, the first decision is, are we going to go forward with this bill at all? And once we decide that, then we can get down into the kind of nitty gritty of under what conditions. But at this point, the decision to move forward, if we do nothing, then the license does not get renewed. So that's our first discussion or decision point, and then we can start to flush that out or dress it up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for me, the decision rests with what kind of language we can incorporate and the sort of, you know, uh, safety provisions or whatever. And so those amendments are, I don't know, they're helpful for me to understand what our options are to make this more palatable or efficient and moving forward. So I just want to understand what's on the table. And so next time, maybe we can start with Luke. Next time we take the bill up.
That's assuming we have Luke.
Right. Or Luke replacement, whomever.
Okay, I've got to go. I think Senator Bray's got to go. Senator Sirotkin is gone. So thank you, everyone. And